Hello, my name is Joshua Helms, and my partner is Caroline Dickey. We are going to talk about St. Philip's Church, and later she'll talk about St. Michael's. St. Philip's was founded in 1681, and it was located in Charleston on 142 Church Street, right next to the famous Dock Street Theater. I'm just going to talk about the history a little bit. It's going to go through a timeline, basically. So in 1680 to 1681, 10 years after the colony was settled, Charlestown moved across the Ashley River from Albemarle Point. The first St. Philip's is built at the corner of Meeting and Broad Street, the present site of St. Michael's. In 1710, the church was badly damaged by a hurricane, and a new brick building was authorized at the present site, which is the second church. The second church, in 1713, was nearly destroyed by a hurricane during its construction. In 1719, Alexander Garden was sent by the Bishop of London to be the commissary, and I'll touch on him a little bit later. 1721, the work on the second church resumed. 1727, the first church at Meeting and Broad was taken down, so that's the original church. 1728 through 1740, fires, hurricanes, epidemics of smallpox, yellow fever, slave uprisings such as the Stono Rebellion, which we talked about a little bit throughout the class, Indian attacks, threats of war from the Spanish occurred. In 1737, George Whitefield preached at St. Philip's and was later expelled as a vagabond clergyman by Commissary Garden after hearing an ecclesiastical court. In 1731, due to a large increase in attendance at St. Philip's, St. Michael's was authorized to be built at Meeting and Broad Streets. 10 years later, St. Michael's held its first service. 1780, the Revolutionary War period, he fell to the bridge that same year. 1785, Robert Smith, who was the assistant rector in the year before, returned and was active in the formation of the new church in America. And so that kind of ends the colonial period for St. Philip's, but just some cool takeaways from this is that Robert Smith kind of helped identify a new American religion in the South. So you have Anglicanism that was present in the colonies, but then you see it kind of shifting towards what it is today, which is Episcopalianism. And then towards the Civil War period in 1835, the second St. Philip's Church burned to the ground and was rebuilt at a rapid pace. The congregation met for a short time at Cumberland Methodist Church, and beginning in May moved to the Tabernacle and Temporary Building. So throughout this period you see a lot of switching back and forth, and they're trying to establish where they are today. And some notable figures who are buried there and who may have attended the church in the past. In 1850, John C. Calhoun, who was a South Carolinian native, and as well as senator, who was buried there, as well as the guy who created the Gadsden flag, Christopher Gadsden, which is the Don't Tread on Me, who's a Revolutionary War figure. Later, his grandson, Christopher Edward Gadsden, was one of the rectors of the church, and his other grandson was known for the Gadsden Purchase. So that wraps up the history of St. Philip's, and now I'm going to be moving on to the graveyard surrounding it, because there's as much history in that graveyard as much as the building. So one highlight of St. Philip's is the graveyard, and you have a lot of it just with interesting graves. You have one grave there which was a skeleton laying down, looking like it's sleeping, to creepy little cherub figures. I just thought that was a really unique thing, and most of those graves were well preserved, made out of slate rather than ones out of concrete or stone. They were all blurry, and you can barely make out who was buried there compared to the slate ones, which seem to be in a much better condition. Now, the graveyard was also sectioned off when we went there. There was a smaller portion of the graveyard, and I think there was a notable figure there. I don't remember who it was, but we couldn't go into that graveyard because of the structural integrity of the church was starting to become compromised. There were pieces of the roof falling off, so they closed it off just to repair that. Which also shows that the church is taking care of this building very seriously, and that they don't want anybody to get hurt, and also to preserve the integrity of this old building. So that's basically the graveyard. I mean, a lot of people focused on there, and I think a lot of the wealth from that. Our articles state that a lot of the wealth that came from St. Philip's when they were done with St. Michael's, it just seemed to be poured into the graveyard as well as maintaining the structure. Speaking of structure, you have architecture. Beauty of Holiness book has several sketches on architecture and what the building looked like and what it was becoming. So we will show sketches of that periodically throughout this video. Now the style of the church was Wren's Gibbs tradition, which was Christopher Wren and James Gibbs were prominent church architects of that time, and a lot of English clergymen brought that over because they found that tradition to be very popular. And the creator of the building was a man named Joseph Hyde, and the guy who erected the steeple was Edward Brickell White. The church was built 3 separate times, as I mentioned. The first time it was wooden, second time it was brick, and the third time it was still brick, but they wanted to make it more stable, so they put stucco around it, but it was brick and stucco. The church was modeled after St. Martin's in London, and it was Palladian architecture. Now, inside the church, you have what looked to be granite or marble flooring, kind of like checkered. So if you look at a chessboard, it looked very similar to a chessboard. Often when I was walking in there, I felt like I was like a pawn. Inside it was very beautiful. It had stained glass, and then you can look out to make out some of the graveyards. And since we weren't able to see part of the graveyard, you can still peek out and see who was who, which still made it kind of like an adventure almost. It was just very beautiful inside. So I want to conclude my section, and I was talking about the history of the church, the graveyard, and the architecture. And one last thing, I forgot to mention this before, but with the graveyard, so you have all these fires coming up. A lot of the congregation thought that they were safe from the fire due to the graveyard, since the graveyard is so large. But what happened was they sent a slave to go investigate whether or not the church was on fire, so they climbed up to the top of the church and lowered the slave down, and then some weird spark happened which caused everything in the church to catch on fire, and then they had to rebuild it. So about 2 or 3 years, just a lot faster paced than the other fires and everything. But now I'm going to leave it to Caroline to talk about St. Michael's.
18 years after the completion of St. Philip's, St. Michael's was born and stands as the oldest surviving religious structure in Charleston. St. Michael's Church is rightfully described as the epitome of Georgian architecture in South Carolina. It also stands as a great example of genteel design and is one of America's most acclaimed colonial churches. St. Michael's, along with St. Philip's, also demonstrate the remarkable cosmopolitan influence of Charleston. The church was first founded when the parish of St. Philip's Church petitioned the Governor's Council of Charleston to erect a second Anglican church in the city. St. Philip's could simply not hold the swelling population of Anglicans coming into Charleston. The money for the building came half from public coffers and the other half from the public subscription of pews. 3 artisans played a leading role in the design of St. Michael's Church: Samuel Carty, Thomas Elf, and Henry Burnett. There is a debate on who is the main architect of St. Michael's, but there is no doubt that it bears a resemblance to a church in London named St. Martin's in the Field, which was designed by James Gibbs in 1720. It took 11 years to complete the church, and it was finally opened in 1762. This delay in completion was from a cycle of obtaining and running out of funds. Throughout time, St. Michael's has amazingly survived several hurricanes, wars, fires, earthquakes, and a cyclone, with little alteration to its architecture. When the building is damaged, the body of the church worked together to restore or reconstruct the damaged parts. The building stands as an important landmark in the nation's history. St. Michael's has seen such visitors such as Robert E. Lee and George Washington. During the Revolutionary War, the church steeple of St. Michael's was a target for British ship gunners, and so they actually painted the steeple black to try and hide it, but instead it actually made it stand out more against the blue sky, so it actually made it more noticeable than before. But that's just an interesting fact of how throughout time it's been involved in so many important conflicts. Michael's churchyard, adjacent to the church, is small but very significant because it holds the bodies of 2 signers of the U.S. Constitution, Charles Pinckney and John Rutledge. When designing St. Michael's, they had a policy of the bigger the better. Their plan was to make a more expensive and therefore better St. Philip's. St. Michael's is one of the few city churches in America that has retained its original design. From the outside of the 2-story stucco brick church is defined by its giant classical portico and the 186-foot high, massively proportioned steeple. Later, after its completion, a set of 8 bells was put in the steeple. And the clock on the steeple is thought to be the oldest functioning colonial clock tower in the country. On the inside, the altar is close to the congregation in a shallow recess, with the choir and organ in the rear. A gallery on the three sides brought the people closer to the center of worship. One of the most remarkable aspects of St. Michael's Church was the surviving records of the 2 pew subscriptions that provide a window into the social politics of the day. The almost 100 pews that are in the church were arranged in a very particular order that held political and social significance. The more wealthy or influential you were, the closer to the front that you sat, and each box was owned by either a particular person or family. Many details of the building's architecture were left to the discretion of individual artists, and many of them took liberties which made them unique. The original pulpit still stands in St. Michael's. It is a hexagon-shaped domed canopy with 6 independent ribs carrying a pineapple design on top, in addition to the 2 fluted Corinthian columns. In 1865, during the federal bombardment, a shell burst near the altar and a scar can still be seen at the base of the pulpit. The Venetian and Egyptian windows near the altar were given later and display beautiful stained glass. The most striking difference between St. Michael's and other churches in the area was how it mirrored modern transformations in 18th century Anglican belief. St. Michael's lacked the appearance of supernatural creatures, which is unique from churches beforehand. St. James of Goose Creek, which was one of the first churches established in Charleston, has a lot of cherubs and other supernatural creatures because that was just a sign of the times. But St. Michael's doesn't have any of that, doesn't have any carvings or any objects of supernatural significance such as cherubs, which was very unique. St. Michael's houses an 18th century font that survived in only a handful of churches. The placement of the font near the entrance signified baptism's role as the point of entry into the Christian life. The London-made font is an oval basin of marble supported by a mahogany pedestal. Covering the basin is a canopy attached to a brass dove that serves as a counterweight that allows the canopy to be lifted easily. When the canopy was lifted, the dove descends, symbolizing the descent of the Holy Spirit in the sacrament of baptism. These 2 churches have so much in common, and I feel like their histories are really intertwined in a lot of ways, and I think one of the biggest ways their histories are intertwined is just the common thread of just the Anglican Church. They're both, if you think about it, St. Michael's is almost a sister church to St. Philip's in the way that it came about and everything that happened there, so the 2 churches are just forever intertwined in a lot of ways.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, definitely St. Philip's came first and then St. Michael's came after, but like in a way, like you said, like sister churches, or like St. Philip's is almost like a knockoff version of St. Michael's.
Yeah.
You have St. Philip's and all its grandeur is just smaller compared to St. Michael's.
Yeah.
I know I talk a lot about the graveyard in my portion, but I think the graveyard is a lot better than St. Michael's. I mean, both have their fair share of history. I know Dr. Smith touches on that. But you have like notable figures such as John C. Calhoun and Gadsden, and then another guy I don't remember the name of. But I feel like when it came to wealth, both were churches for the wealthy, and like you said, St. Philip's is getting crowded, and then they can choose to go to St. Michael's. But I think they boiled down to where they lived in the city, which was closer, different dynamics and everything. But when it came to St. Philip's, I feel like the wealth would be more important to the graveyard, and just preserving the church, because you have St. Michael's, which is trying to be bigger and better, like you state, and then like it's like when they have enough people, like, okay, let's move on, let's get a bigger and better church. I can imagine like someone who like was alive during the time of like everything happening. I know that's not realistic, but imagine probably they're getting tired of like having to like go to church and can't go into church because they have to rebuild it, repair it, and then when they can, something else happens. So I feel like that could be a factor, but I know you have to space out time and stuff, and nobody can live that long. Yeah, definitely. I think you're right. I think one similarity that they both have is I think that George Whitefield preached that both of them. I know that. I say that he gets kicked out as being this vagabond preacher, but with all he did, I think he deserves more credit than me in that. But I think he did a lot for South Carolina by preaching at both churches.
Yeah, and I feel like if you just look at even the history of Anglicanism, just even in the States, not even just in Charleston, a lot of it goes back to churches like St. Michael's and St. Philip's that really pioneered the movement, the Great Awakening, how it kind of came on the cusp of that and how that impacted Americans and going to church and all that kind of stuff, and just how important it was. And there's just so much significance and so much you can learn from the little things, like the little details that tell you about what they believed at the time and why they believed it and what may have been different. Well, I think that we can both agree, even though these are different churches and they have slightly different histories and architecture and stuff like that, they were both very significant and remain very significant, just not even in religious history, but architectural history and Charleston history and Anglican history, like so many different realms. And the fact that they still stand today and St. Michael's having an active congregation even, I just feel like shows their lasting power and their importance, and just how the two histories are intertwined, I think are just really important. To fully understand St. Michael's, you have to know some about St. Philip's, and it's either or. You kind of have to take both.
I think looking at both churches, if you're doing like a biography of people who attended churches from that area, even if you're just doing church histories in Americas, I think that these two churches have very, very vital information towards that, as well as if you're just studying Anglicanism in America. It kind of goes into church history, but like tiny church history and architecture and stuff, but solely just for the Anglicanism and like the start of the Episcopal Church. It's just a wealth of information overall.